The numbers were perfect. Every single one of them. Dr. Rael Davin had spent 11 years making sure of that. 11 years of silent observation. 11 years of long-range scans, intercepted transmissions, biological samples collected from sites the humans never even knew had been visited. He had built the most complete picture of a foreign species that the Serati Collective had ever produced. And now, standing before the High Council in the cold blue light of the command chamber, he presented it without a single moment of doubt. The display behind him filled the entire wall. Graphs, chemical diagrams, skeletal maps, neurological firing patterns. He walked through each one with calm precision. Human bone density within predicted failure thresholds. Human cardiac limits under stress, well documented. Human cognitive performance after 48 hours without sleep. Significant degradation. Human response to fear stimuli. Predictable, chemical, and consistent across the species regardless of geographic origin. Human social behavior under isolation. Compliance followed within 72 hours. The council listened without interrupting. They were tall, gray-skinned, still as stone. Their large dark eyes moved across the data displays, and they communicated in the small chemical pulses that passed between their kind. Rael had learned to read a few of those signals over the years. What he read now was satisfaction. When he finished, the eldest council member, who was called Dovin Sar, gave a single, slow nod. The data confirms what we suspected. They are physically capable but structurally fragile, emotionally reactive, prone to internal conflict. They will not unite under pressure. They will fracture. Rael agreed. The data said so. Commander Sarah On stood at the far edge of the chamber. She was broad for a Serati, decorated with the gray rank marks of 15 campaigns. She had not asked a single question during the briefing. She did not need to. What she needed was authorization, and she received it before Rael had even closed his data files. Begin the subjugation protocol, Dovin Sar said. Target the outer extraction sites. First, low population, low resistance. Confirm our projections before moving inward. Sarah On left the chamber without a word. Rael began packing his files. One of the junior council members paused near him on the way out. You are confident? The junior member asked, not in challenge, but in the way one scientist checks another. The sample size is enormous, Rael said. The patterns are consistent. We know their pain thresholds, their fear triggers, their breaking points. We know what they eat, how long they sleep, how their bodies respond to pressure. There is no meaningful variable we have not accounted for. The junior member nodded and left. Rael stood alone for a moment in the emptying chamber, looking at the last image still glowing on the wall. It was a human, a man, standing in an open space somewhere on one of their outer mining stations, looking up at the stars. Rael had pulled the image from an intercepted personal transmission years ago. He had kept it in the file not for scientific value, but because it was a clear image. Good resolution. He closed the display. The man disappeared. 17 hours later, Sarah On's lead vessel dropped out of transit near the asteroid belt on the outer edge of human space. The mining station there was called Riga 9. It had a crew of 31. It had no weapons, no military personnel, and no shielding beyond standard debris deflection. On Riga 9, a senior engineer named Yusuf Adeyemi was 3 hours into a routine diagnostic on the station's long-range communication array when the sensors picked up something large. He ran the reading twice. Then he called the station supervisor. That is not a natural object, Yusuf said. The supervisor looked at the screen. It could be a rock with a dense metal core. It is moving against the gravity gradient, Yusuf said. Rocks do not do that. They tried to send a transmission. The signal went out and did not come back confirmed. Something was blocking it. Yusuf switched to the emergency burst frequency and typed a short message. Coordinates. Contact signature. Unknown object. He hit send. The lights went out 3 seconds later. Not gradually. Not flickering. All at once, clean and total, as if the station had simply been switched off. Emergency lighting kicked in, red and low. The crew began shouting. Yusuf did not shout. He moved to the emergency panel and tried to restore the communication array manually. His hands were steady. He got 2 seconds of power. before the whole board went dead. Then the hull rang. A low, deep sound, like something large pressing against it from outside. Then the sound of a seal being cut. Yusuf stepped back from the panel. He looked around at the people in the room. He was not a soldier. He was an engineer. There was nothing in the room that was going to stop what was coming through that hull. The door to the corridor blew inward. Not explosively, just cleanly removed, like a panel being lifted off. Four Sarati soldiers stepped through. Tall, gray, completely silent. Their movements were practiced and precise, and within 90 seconds, every human on Riga 9 was restrained and being moved toward the docking corridor. Yusuf was the last one walked out. He looked back once at the dead communication panel. The emergency burst had gone out. He did not know if anyone had received it. Aboard the Sarati vessel, Rail Davin reviewed the capture report. 31 humans. Secured. No casualties. No resistance. Exactly as predicted. He made a note in his file. Subjugation protocol initiated. Initial contact confirms. Biological and behavioral models. Subjects responded to overwhelming force with immediate compliance. Projected timeline for full campaign, viable. He looked at the list of captured humans. One name had been flagged by the boarding team, marked as the individual who attempted to send a transmission in the final moments before power was cut. Yusuf Adeyemi, senior engineer, age 38. Rail noted him for observation. Not because he was concerned, because the data liked specifics. We know everything about what they are made of, Rail said quietly to his empty office. The rest is irrelevant. He believed that completely. He would not always. The cell was not cruel. That was the first thing Yusuf noticed. The temperature was controlled. Not cold, not warm. Exact. The light was steady and soft, timed to a cycle that matched a normal human day almost perfectly. The food came through a slot in the wall 3 times per cycle, and while it tasted like almost nothing, it contained everything a human body needed. He had checked the portions against what he knew about basic nutrition. Whoever designed this environment had done their homework. That told him something important. They were not trying to break him. They were trying to maintain him. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. Rail Davin watched the human on the observation feed from a separate room. He had assigned Yusuf to cell 44, specifically the cell with the most complete sensor coverage, heart rate, skin temperature, cortisol levels pulled from air sampling. Rail had seen this pattern before across his other human subjects. The first day, elevated stress. The second day, declining. By the third day, Yusuf's readings had normalized almost entirely. The model was confirmed. Isolation plus stability equaled compliance. The human was settling. Rail made a note. Subject 44 displays accelerated normalization. Stress markers. Below threshold. Behaviorally cooperative. No resistance indicators. What Rail's sensors could not measure was what Yusuf was doing with his eyes. Yusuf had stopped counting hours after the first day. Counting hours was something people did when they were waiting to be rescued. He was not waiting. He was learning. The guards changed rotation every period. He figured out the timing by the sound of footsteps. 2 guards per corridor. They moved in the same pattern every single time. Without variation. Their footsteps were heavier near the door at the start of a rotation and lighter near the end, which meant they were moving from a rest position. He noted the delay between his food slot opening and the sound of the guard stopping. Outside. Always 11 seconds. Consistent. He tested it. He dropped his food tray on the floor. Metal on metal. Loud. The footsteps. Outside stopped. Then started moving. Guard at the door in 8 seconds. Yusuf noted. It picked up the tray and sat back down looking unconcerned. He did it again the next cycle. Same result. 8 seconds. He did it a third time, but just before the end of a rotation period. Different guard. Arriving. 12 seconds. The new guard was slightly farther away when the shift started. Yusuf ate his food and said nothing. His face was calm. His heart, according to Rails sensors, was also calm. What his heart was doing and what his brain was doing were 2 entirely separate things. On the third day, a low-ranking Sarati soldier named Garo was assigned to his corridor for the first time. Garo was young by Sarati standards and had not served on a human observation mission before. His assignment was simple: walk the corridor, check the seal readings, file a report. Routine. He stopped outside cell 44 and looked through the observation slit. The human was sitting on the edge of his resting surface, elbows on his knees, staring at the wall across from him. Not in distress, not sleeping, just sitting, thinking. Perhaps Garo had been told that humans in isolation became withdrawn, anxious, erratic. He had read the behavioral projections. He had expected to see something that looked like fear. This did not look like fear. This looked like someone waiting for a bus. Garo filed his report and said nothing about it. But he came back the following cycle and looked again. Same posture, same stillness. Garo mentioned it, carefully, to the senior guard. The senior guard looked at Rail's notes and said the human had normalized. It was expected. Garo nodded and let it go. But he kept looking. Meanwhile, 340 million kilometers away, a small emergency transit pod was moving through deep space at its maximum speed, which was not very fast. Inside it, a field medic named Nadia Reeves had been alone for 19 hours. She had a cracked shoulder, 3 burn patches on her left arm from a power surge during the Riga 9 attack, and approximately 4 days of food and water. The pod had no weapons and no stealth capability. What it had was a working long-range radio transmitter and an emergency frequency that human relay stations were required by protocol to monitor. She had been transmitting continuously since she escaped. Her message was short: coordinates of the attack, description of the vessels, number of crew taken. She repeated it every 2 hours. She did not know if anyone was receiving it. She kept transmitting anyway. On the 14th hour, a response came back. Static at first, then a voice. Human. Military channel encryption pattern. Unidentified pod. This is Relay Station 7 under Admiral Dex calls command. Confirm your identity and position. Nadia closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and answered. Back on the Sarati vessel, Yusuf had started a new project. The ventilation system ran along the upper wall of his cell. The grate was sealed with a simple locking mechanism that he could not reach from the floor. But during the maintenance cycle, when the environmental system ran a pressure equalization, the grate shifted slightly. A small gap, not enough to do anything with. But the pressure equalization happened on a fixed cycle, and the gap appeared in the same spot every time. Yusuf began tearing thin strips from the edge of his sleeping mat. The mat was synthetic and layered. The inner layer was denser. He rolled the strips carefully and set them aside, hidden under the mat. He did not know exactly what he would do with them yet. He just knew he needed something that could reach 4 inches higher than his hand. Rail checked the sensors that evening. All readings normal. Compliance holding. He moved on to the next subject file without a second thought. The message went out on every human frequency at once. The Sarati had spent 4 months preparing it. Rail had personally reviewed the script 17 times. Every word had been chosen based on the psychological data. The tone was designed to produce a specific hormonal response in the human listener. Cortisol elevation followed by a drop in the chemical markers associated with aggression and decision-making. In simpler terms, it was built to make people feel small and then stop fighting. The voice was synthesized perfectly. No accent, no error. It sounded like a human who had given up already and was telling everyone else to do the same. People of Earth and her colonies, you have been evaluated. Your capacity for organized resistance has been measured and found insufficient. Surrender your command structures within 72 hours and the transition will be orderly. Resistance will cost lives that do not need to be lost. The data supports only one conclusion: you cannot win. The message repeated on a loop. Every channel, every relay, every station. Rail watched the reaction through intercepted transmissions and long-range signal monitoring. He expected 72 hours of chaos, followed by fracturing, followed by pockets of localized resistance that would collapse under coordinated pressure. That was what the model said. That was what the chemistry of fear and isolation predicted. He had the graphs. What actually happened was nothing like the graphs. On Earth, a retired soldier named Bryn Okafor heard the message on his kitchen radio, sat still for about 10 seconds, and then drove to the nearest enlistment office. He was 61 years old and had bad knees. He did not care. On a colony station over Mars, an engineer named Priya stopped arguing with her supervisor about a budget dispute mid-sentence, looked at the ceiling where the broadcast was coming from, and went to find the station's emergency supply locker. In 100 cities on 4 worlds, people who had been shouting at each other about borders and resources and old grievances went very quiet. And then they got to work. Teenagers told recruitment systems they were 19. Retired pilots pulled their certification files out of storage. Cargo crews rerouted their ships toward military coordinates without being asked. No single person gave an order that caused all of this. It just happened, all at once, because the message had made one enormous mistake. It had told humanity that someone had decided they were already finished. Admiral Dex Call's response broadcast went out 11 hours after the Sarati message. It was not a long speech. It was 43 words. His voice was flat and direct and had absolutely no drama in it, which somehow made it worse for anyone listening who was not human. They say the data supports one conclusion. They have not met all of us yet. Show up. Work hard. We will handle the rest. That was it. No promises. No heroic language. Just the plain expectation that people would do what needed to be done. It became the most repeated transmission in human space within 6 hours. On the Sarati vessel, Rail received the intercepted response and ran it through his models 3 times. The results made no sense. Predicted compliance rate after the surrender broadcast, 71% within 48 hours. Actual measured response, mass mobilization. Recruitment signals flooding military channels. Civilian vessels altering course toward defensive positions. He called up his fear response data. He called up his isolation data. He called up the chemical models for human decision-making under existential threat. Everything said humans in this scenario should be fracturing. The data was not wrong. He had checked it 100 times. He did not yet understand that the data had only ever measured what happened to individual humans under controlled conditions. And what was happening now was not controlled. It was not individual. Humans were doing something his models had no category for. They were deciding together, without being organized, without a single command structure pushing them to simply not accept what they had been told. Spite, it turned out, did not appear on any of Rail's chemical charts. In cell 44, Yusuf did not hear the broadcast. The cell had no external audio feed. But that same cycle, the maintenance pressure equalization ran 6 seconds. Longer than usual. He noticed immediately. Something had changed in the ship's systems. External activity of some kind. He filed it quietly in his head. He had finished building his reaching tool 3 cycles ago. A thin, stiff rod made from rolled mat material, long enough to hook the ventilation grate latch from below. He had tested the reach twice during maintenance cycles when the sensors in the upper wall ran their recalibration pause. A 4-second window were the motion sensors above. The grate reset. Not enough time to do anything, but enough time to confirm the hook worked. Now he waited for the right moment. Not impatience, not fear, just timing. The extended maintenance pulse meant the ship's systems were being pushed. Something external, which meant attention was divided, which meant this was the moment. When the next maintenance cycle ran, Yusuf was already standing beneath the grate. The sensor pause began. He hooked the latch. It turned. The grate shifted. He pulled himself up in the remaining seconds with the kind of fast and ugly physical effort that had nothing elegant about it, scraping his shoulder against the edge, and got himself into the ventilation shaft just as the motion sensors came back online. He lay still in the dark for a full minute, breathing quietly. Then he started moving. Garo came to do his corridor check 20 minutes later and found cell 44 empty. He stood at the door for a moment. Then he walked fast to the communication post and reported to Rail. The subject has left the observation unit. On the other end of the line, there was silence. Not short silence. Long silence. The kind that meant something had gone wrong that had not been in the plan. Rail stared at his data screen. His models had predicted full compliance. His models had predicted this human would still be sitting calmly in that cell for another 14 cycles. His models had been watching the wrong thing entirely. Find him, Rail said finally. Garo went to find him. He did not find him. The ventilation system on a Sarati Warship had over 3 kilometers of internal ducting, and Yusuf had already mapped the first 200 meters of it from sound alone. Yusuf found the first junction in the dark by feel alone. He had no light. He had no tools. He had the rolled mat rod, the clothes on his back, and 11 days of careful listening. He knew which direction the engine vibration came from. He knew which vents carried warm recycled air from the crew section and which ones pulled cold from the outer hull. He moved toward the cold ones. Outer hull meant maintenance corridors. Maintenance corridors meant access to the ship's systems. He was not trying to be a hero. He was an engineer. He was doing the only thing that made sense to him, looking at a broken situation and figuring out what he could reach. The first thing he reached was a coolant distribution line running along a maintenance panel in the lower duct. He recognized the component type. Sarati and human ships used different designs, but the physics of keeping a reactor from overheating was the same everywhere. He did not sever it. He found the flow regulator and turned it down by approximately 15%. Not enough to cause an alarm, just enough to make the secondary cooling loop work slightly harder. He moved on. Over the next 2 cycles, he made 6 more small adjustments. A sensor relay junction, with a loose coupling that he encouraged to become looser. A power distribution node, where 2 secondary lines connected, which he crossed in a way that would cause intermittent signal noise rather than a clean fault. Nothing loud, nothing that shouted. Sabotage. Just a ship that was beginning to feel slightly unwell without knowing why. Back in Rail's office, the system reports were starting to carry small yellow flags. Minor inefficiencies. Nothing critical. The engineering team was investigating. Rail was not focused on the engineering flags. He was focused on his collapsing models. He had rerun the behavioral prediction suite 4 times. Every time, the output was the same. Isolated human, no social bonds, no rescue signal confirmed, optimal physical conditions. Predicted outcome, compliance and psychological withdrawal. Actual outcome, escape. The model was not wrong about the biology. The cortisol readings had been normal. The stress markers had been below threshold. The human had genuinely not been in acute distress. And then he had left anyway. Rail pulled up every data point he had on motivation and decision-making. The chemical drivers were all there. Humans required social reinforcement to maintain morale. They needed external validation to sustain effort. They were vulnerable to despair under prolonged isolation. All of it was right, and none of it had stopped this man from spending 11 days quietly building a plan. Garo knocked on Rail's door and entered without waiting for an answer, which was unusual for him. "I want to say something," Garo said. "I am busy," Rail said. "I know. I still want to say it." Garo stood there until Rail looked up. "I watched that human for many cycles. He did not behave like your models said he would. The model was working from valid data. The model was watching his body," Garo said. "I was watching his face. They were not saying the same thing." Rail stared at him. "You are a corridor guard, Garo, not a behavioral analyst. I know what I saw. What you saw was confirmed by the sensor readings as normalization. Compliance. What I saw," Garo said carefully, "looked like someone who had decided something and was waiting for the right moment to do it." Rail did not respond. Garo left. Rail turned back to his models and ran them again. On the edge of the Sol system, Admiral Dexcall was looking at a tactical map with Nadia Reeves standing beside him. Nadia's arm was in a compression wrap, and she had slept approximately 6 hours in the last 3 days. She did not look like someone who had just survived a solo emergency transit in a pod with failing stabilizers. She looked like someone who had somewhere to be. "The forward sensor network is the problem," she said. "They cannot see us coming if we can degrade it first. I watched their sensor crews when I was on the station. They are fast and they are thorough, but they operate on a fixed verification cycle. If you hit the outer nodes during the handoff window between cycles, there is a gap." Call looked at her. "How large a gap?" 40 seconds. "Maybe 50. That is not much." "No," Nadia agreed. "But they are going to expect a clean, coordinated strike. Every military model they have built is based on human tactical doctrine. So we do not use human tactical doctrine. We go loud. We go wrong on purpose. We go like a bar fight, not a military operation." We hit things that don't make sense to hit in the order we hit them. We make it look like we have no plan. Cole was quiet for a moment. And do we have a plan? Yes, Nadia said. But it has to look like we don't. The strike went out 40 hours later. It was, by any formal military standard, a mess. 3 different squadrons arrived at slightly different times from slightly different angles. One group opened fire on a sensor relay that had no strategic value. Another hit a secondary fuel depot on the outer network that should not have been a priority target. The Sirati defense system analyzed the attack pattern, ran it against all known human tactical models, and determined it was disorganized and manageable. It determined this while every single one of its forward sensor nodes went dark in the gap between verification cycles. The outer network was blind before the Sirati defense system finished its analysis. On the Sirati command deck, Commander Sarah looked at the blank sensor feeds and said nothing for a long moment. Then she turned to her tactical team. Find me a pattern in what they did, she said. The tactical team looked for a pattern. They could not find one, because the pattern was that there was no pattern, and that was not in any model they had. Rail received the sensor network report at the same moment that his engineering team found the 7th unexplained system fault aboard the ship. He looked at both reports. Side by side, 1 human loose inside the ship, 1 human coordinated strike on the outer network, both operating without any predictable logic, both working. He opened Garo's last report again, the one where Garo said the human's face and his body were not saying the same thing. He read it twice. He was beginning to understand that he had studied the wrong subject entirely. Sarah activated the combat protocol at the start of the next cycle. It was the most sophisticated defensive system the Sirati had ever built for use against a specific enemy. Every response algorithm had been fed human behavioral data. It knew that human pilots broke formation under sustained fire. It knew that human infantry fell back when casualties exceeded 30%. It knew the exact frequency range that disrupted human communication equipment, the precise light pulse pattern that caused disorientation in human visual processing, and the optimal pressure for hull breaches that would force immediate evacuation rather than resistance. For the first hour, it worked exactly as designed. Nadia's assault squadrons took heavy losses at the outer perimeter. 2 ships went dark. In the first 10 minutes, the communication disruptors forced 3 others to break coordination. The Sirati defense system watched the human formation fragment and flagged the engagement as proceeding within predicted parameters. Then the human pilots stopped flying like pilots. 1 squadron leader, with 2 engines damaged and no functioning communications, flew his ship directly into the Sirati sensor array rather than retreating. Not as a suicide run. He survived. He just aimed his disabled ship at the array like a battering ram. Ejected at the last second and let physics do the work. The sensor array had not been listed as a priority target in any human tactical model. The Sirati defense system had not allocated protection to it accordingly. Another group of human ships, completely cut off from the fleet, stopped trying to fight their way through and started flying in unpredictable spirals between Sirati vessels, not attacking, just existing in spaces that made targeting solutions impossible. Without risking friendly fire, they stayed there for 40 minutes while the rest of the fleet reorganized. They were buying time in the most annoying way possible. The Sirati combat protocol kept trying to find the pattern. It kept updating. It kept running predictive models. It could not keep up because the humans had stopped asking themselves what the correct move was and started asking themselves what would work. Right now, in this specific second, 2 different questions. The first one has an answer. You can model. The second one does not. Inside the ship, Yusuf had reached the reactor access corridor. He had known for 2 cycles that this was where he was going. The reactor control room was the one place on a warship where a single person could influence everything. He was not planning to destroy the ship. That was not the goal, and he was not built for gestures. What he wanted was the engine override, a hardwired emergency system that existed on every spacecraft regardless of design, because every intelligent species that had ever built a faster-than-light drive had also built a way to stop it from moving. If something went wrong, if he locked the engines, the ship could not maneuver, could not flee, and could not orient its weapons systems effectively. It became a stationary object. And Nadia's fleet, if it was out there, could treat a stationary object very differently from a moving warship. The corridor was narrow and lit in red emergency lighting. The outer engagement had triggered damage protocols throughout the ship. Yusuf moved fast, not quietly. There was enough noise from the ship's systems under stress that his footsteps did not matter. He found the reactor access panel, identified the override controls, and started working. Sarah saw him on the emergency monitors at the same moment. "Garo," she said over the internal channel. "Reactor corridor." Now, Garo was already close. He had been moving through the ship looking for the human. 4-2 cycles without finding him, and when the emergency lighting came on he had shifted toward the reactor section on instinct, because it was where he would have gone if he were trying to cause trouble. He came around the corner and saw Yusuf. Yusuf looked up. He did not run. There was nowhere to run to. He looked at Garo. The way a person looks at something they have already thought through. Garo had a restraint weapon on his belt. He was larger than Yusuf by a significant amount. He was faster. He was trained. Every physical variable was in his favor. He stopped. He had watched this human for weeks. He had watched him sit in a cell and look calm. When the fear readings said he should have been breaking, he had watched him disappear from a sealed room. He had tried to tell Rael and had been dismissed. And now here was the human, alone, inside the reactor corridor of an enemy warship, working on controls he should not have been able to find, with a restraint weapon pointed roughly in his direction. Garo looked at Yusuf's hands. They were still moving, still working the panel. He was not stopping. He was not begging. He was not posturing. He was just continuing to do the thing he had come here to do, even with Garo standing right there. Garo had been told humans were predictable. He had read the data. He understood the biology. And standing in that corridor, he felt, for the first time in his career, that he had absolutely no idea what this creature in front of him was going to do next. He hesitated. For seconds. 5. 6. The override locked. The ship shuddered. The engines cut to zero. The maneuvering thrusters fired randomly. For 2 seconds trying to compensate, and then died. The Sarati warship, which had been turning to bring its main weapons to bear on the incoming human fleet, stopped. Sarah felt it on the command deck. She looked at the engine status panel. She looked at the tactical display. She said, very quietly, one word that translated roughly as, no. Outside, Nadia Reeves saw the warship stop moving on her tactical screen. She stared at it for 1 full second. Then she opened the fleet channel. All ships. The target is stationary. Move in. Full formation. Garo had not moved. Yusuf looked at him. Between them, the panel blinked with a steady green light, confirming the override was active. "I am not going to run," Yusuf said. Garo lowered the restraint weapon slowly. Not because he had decided to let the human go. He was not sure what he had decided. He just could not make himself finish. The action his training was telling him to do. Something about this moment would not let him. Yusuf nodded once and moved past him toward the emergency pod bay. Outside, the human fleet closed in around a ship that could no longer move, and the engagement that the Sarati combat protocol had predicted would end in human defeat ended in something else entirely. The surrender took 6 hours to negotiate. Not because the Sarati argued. They did not argue. They simply had no framework for the situation. Surrender was not something that appeared in Sarati military doctrine, because it had never been necessary before. Sarah stood in the airlock corridor, while human soldiers moved through her ship with weapons raised, and she said very little. She answered direct questions directly. She did not look at the floor. She did not look particularly broken. She looked like someone doing a very difficult calculation in her head and not yet having reached an answer. Garo surrendered separately. He walked to the nearest human soldier, placed his restraint weapon on the floor, and waited. He did not try to explain himself. He would explain himself later, when there was someone willing to listen. Yusuf was pulled from an escape pod that had launched but not traveled far, drifting in low orbit of nothing in particular. He had a bruised shoulder, shallow cuts from the ventilation shaft, and the slightly distant look of a man who had been running on controlled adrenaline for 2 weeks and was now coming down from it. A medic checked him over on the recovery ship. He ate something warm. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, Admiral Call was waiting outside his door. You locked their engines, Call said. It seemed like the thing to do, Yusuf said. Call looked at him for a moment. You were an engineer on a mining station. Yes. You did all of that as an engineer on a mining station. What else was I going to do? Yusuf said, which was not really a question. 3 months later, in a secured room on a station above Earth, Rael Davin sat across from Yusuf for the first time in person. The session had been Admiral Call's idea and Rael had accepted because he needed to understand where his data had failed. That need was not professional. It was the first purely personal need Rael had experienced in many years, and it unsettled him almost as much as everything else that had happened. Nadia sat at the far end of the table. She was there because Call trusted her judgment. She said nothing and watched. Rael opened his files. He had the surveillance footage from the entire period of Yusuf's capture. He walked through it systematically. He pointed to the moment on Day 2 when his sensors had confirmed normalization. He pointed to the tray drop tests. He pointed to the 11 days of steady, calm biological readings. Every measurement I had said you were stable, Rael said. Not under distress. The model predicted that stable and not distressed meant compliant. The measurements were right, Yusuf said. I was not distressed. Then why did you not comply? Yusuf thought about it for a second. Because not being distressed does not mean not having a plan. You were measuring how my body was doing. My body was fine. My body was being fed and kept warm. I was not fine with being a prisoner. Those are two different things. Rael was quiet. He looked at his data. My models treated them as the same thing. I know. I figured that out by day 3. Rael looked up. You knew we were watching the biological markers. I guessed. The cell was too comfortable for someone who wanted me scared. You wanted me stable. So I stayed stable and let you think that meant something it did not mean. Nadia, at the far end of the table, said nothing. But she looked at Yusuf the way people look at someone who has just said the thing everyone else was thinking. Rael turned to the moment in his file where Garo had reported the cell as empty. He studied the timestamp. Then he looked at the footage of the ventilation grate. The sensor paused during maintenance recalibration, he said. For seconds, Yusuf confirmed. Every cycle. Same time. I designed that maintenance cycle. I did not think of it as a vulnerability. You were not thinking about it from inside the cell. Rael closed the file slowly. He had one more question. It was not a professional question. He had been holding it for 3 months. Were you not afraid? He asked. Yusuf looked at him steadily. Of course I was afraid. Every single day. Rael stared. Then how did you function? The fear chemical markers should have. Your data told you what fear does to a human body, Yusuf said. It never told you what a human does with fear. He paused. Fear tells you something is dangerous. We know that. We grew up knowing that. The question is never whether you are afraid. The question is what you do next. Being afraid and doing nothing is one option. Being afraid and doing the thing anyway is also an option. Your models only had the first one. Rael sat with that for a long time. Garo had been given protected status 2 months prior. He had spent that time in a small research room on the same station, working through a request he had made on the first day of his surrender. He had not asked to study human biology. He had not asked to study human military capability. He had asked for access to human history. Not the edited overview in Rael's files. All of it. Every war, every collapse, every time things went completely wrong and people rebuilt anyway. He read for 8 hours a day and filed no reports. He simply read. On the day Rael flew back to Sarati space, he submitted his revised report to the High Council. The report was long and detailed and honest in a way that his previous reports had not been, because his previous reports had not needed to account for being wrong. The title read, Biological Data is Insufficient. Recommend full suspension of the subjugation protocol. Reasons attached. The Council's response came back in 48 hours. Rael read it in his study. The Council was not pleased. They called his conclusions premature. They said the mission had failed due to execution errors, not data errors. They recommended a review committee. They did not suspend the protocol. Rael put the response aside. He opened a different file. It had arrived on his personal channel from the station. Above Earth. It was a translated document. 340,000 words. The subject heading said, simply, Human History, compiled for researcher Garo. Forwarded per request. Rail had not asked for it. Garo had sent it anyway. Rail looked at the first line for a long moment. Then he started reading. The Sarati had studied human biology for 11 years. They had catalogued every breakable thing about the human body. They had been right about almost all of it. They had just studied the wrong subject.